What's going on, guys? Arya here. We're so back. Today we're going to be talking about the First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 1842. Hold on, let me adjust this real quick. How Britain walked into one of the greatest military disasters in all of history. If the Napoleonic Wars were Britain's victory lap and the Victorian Empire was Britain's swagger phase, then the First Anglo-Afghan War was Britain running full speed into a brick wall while insisting everything was under control. This war has imperial paranoia, mountain warfare, political incompetence, double crosses, heroic last stands, and one of history's most disastrous retreats. And it all starts with a geopolitical game of, what if Russia pulls up? The great game begins. Oh, I have a book for you guys on this that we're going to do a literary analysis on, and we're probably going to do a historical analysis on this too. So to understand the war, you need to understand the great game. In the early 1800s, Britain ruled India. India wasn't just any colony, it was the crown jewel of the British Empire, a massive source of doubloons, and the foundation of British power in Asia. The British leadership spent a great deal of time worrying about one thing: Russia. Russia was expanding southwards into Central Asia. British officials imagining Russian armies marching toward India. There was just one problem: Russia wasn't actually preparing to invade India, because that is, pardon my French here, that is fucking ridiculous. But British officials became increasingly convinced that Afghanistan might become a Russian bridgehead into an invasion into the Indian subcontinent. Now, thus began one of history's greatest traditions, fighting a war because of what somebody might do one day, as we can see in more recent times. Sorry. So, meet Dost Muhammad. Afghanistan at the time was ruled by Emir Dost Muhammad Khan. He was actually trying to balance relations between Britain and Russia. His basic message was, "I'd like to be friends with whoever helps Afghanistan." A reasonable request. The British response was essentially, "Why aren't you exclusively our friend?" Negotiations are breaking down. Instead of supporting the ruler already in power, Britain wanted to replace him. Because nothing has ever gone wrong with a foreign power installs a ruler nobody asked for. Enter Shah Shuja. The British found a former Afghan ruler, Shah Shuja Durrani. He had spent years in exile. British officials thought, perfect, we'll put him on the throne and everyone will love him. Afghans did not, in fact, love him. Many viewed him as weak, dependent on foreigners, and a British puppet. The British somehow missed this crucial detail. The invasion of Afghanistan began in 1839. The British and the East India Company launched a massive invasion force through the difficult terrain toward Afghanistan. Their initial advance succeeded and Kabul was occupied. Shah Shuja was installed as ruler while Dost Muhammad was removed from power. At first, everything was dazzling. British reports at home basically said, mission accomplished, which should always make historians nervous. The occupation. So the British now held Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. This is where disaster begins. British leaders made several terrible assumptions. So assumption number one, we won, therefore everyone must like us. Wrong. Assumption number two, Afghan tribes are no longer a threat. Also wrong. Assumption number three, we can reduce military spending. Spectacularly wrong. The occupation became increasingly cheap and complacent. Troops were placed in exposed cantonments outside Kabul rather than stronger defensive positions. Warnings were ignored, and Afghan resentment was sure to grow. Afghanistan gets angry. So Afghans were furious about the foreign occupation, British interference, Shah Shuja's rule, and economic cuts to tribal subsidies. The British misunderstood Afghanistan's political landscape. Many tribal leaders accepted British money, sure, but when the money stopped, so did their loyalty. Funny how that works. By late 1841, rebellion was spreading. Now we get into the fun part, the real meat and potatoes of it all. Everything falls apart. So the revolt exploded in Kabul. British authority collapsed. One of the most famous incidents was the murder of British political officer Sir Alexander Burnes by an angry mob. At this point, competent leadership might have saved the situation. Unfortunately, the British commander was General William Elphinstone. He was elderly, ill, indecisive, and completely overwhelmed by these recent events. Historians frequently point to his leadership as a major factor in the disaster. Imagine putting the least decisive person you know in charge of collapsing military occupation. That is quite literally the situation the British were in. Next is the murder of Macnaghten. So British envoy Sir William Macnaghten attempted negotiations with Afghan leader Akbar Khan. Instead, the talks ended with Macnaghten being killed. At this point, the British position in Kabul was effectively doomed. The occupation had transformed from a victory parade into a survival horror story. Sorry, I'm quite dehydrated. Now, the retreat from Kabul, the famous part. British negotiated safe passage. The agreement promised that the army could withdraw to Jalalabad. This distance wasn't enormous. The problem was everything else. On January 6, 1842, roughly 4,500 soldiers and around 12,000 civilians and camp followers began marching through snow-covered mountain passes. What followed became one of the most infamous retreats in military history. Now, 7 days of hell. So the retreating column faced freezing temperatures, hunger, exhaustion, constant ambushes, and the Afghan fighters attacked repeatedly from the hills. The column disintegrated. Families froze. Soldiers died from exposure, units lost cohesion, and every day the army became smaller. British officers kept expecting the next agreement to save them. Instead, the attacks continued. The mountains showed absolutely no interest in diplomacy. So the final act occurred near Gandamak. A tiny remnant of British troops made a last stand on a snowy hill. Surrounded and outnumbered, they fought until they were overwhelmed. Victorian artists later then turned the scene into one of the most iconic images of imperial warfare. It became Britain's version of "this went horribly wrong, but at least everyone looked brave." The lone survivor. The most famous image of the war involves Dr. William Brydon. In British memory, he became known as the lone survivor who reached Jalalabad after the retreat, though some captives and other survivors existed elsewhere. Brydon became the symbol of the catastrophe. Imagine sitting in Jalalabad and seeing one exhausted rider appear from the mountains, then learning an entire army had vanished. That was the moment Britain realized the scale of the disaster. Now it's time for British revenge. So Britain was fucking pissed. An army of retribution marched back into Afghanistan later in 1842. British forces advanced on Kabul, defeated Afghan resistance, recovered prisoners, and inflicted punitive destruction before withdrawing from the country. The message was, we're leaving, but we're leaving fucking pissed. The ironic ending, after all the bloodshed, Britain ended up abandoning Afghanistan, and then came the most ironic part of the entire war. The British eventually allowed Dost Muhammad, the very same ruler they had overthrown, to return and rule Afghanistan again. So after an invasion, regime change, occupation, rebellion, catastrophic defeat, and punitive expedition, Britain basically ended up where it started. Historians call this a strategic success. Historians are sometimes also very generous. Why Britain lost? So several major reasons stand out. They misunderstood Afghanistan. British leaders assumed Afghan politics worked like European politics. They do not. Installing an unpopular ruler, so Shah Shuja lacked broad legitimacy. Many Afghans viewed him as a foreign-backed puppet. Overconfidence. Initial victories convinced Britain the country was pacified. It was not. Poor leadership. The General Elphinstone proved disastrously ineffective during the crisis and geography. So Afghanistan's mountains, narrow passes, and harsh winters turned every mistake into a catastrophe. Now, the legacy. The First Anglo-Afghan War became one of the greatest humiliations in British military history. It was fought during the Great Game and ended with the destruction of a retreating army and demonstrated the dangers of occupation, regime change, and underestimating local resistance. It also established a pattern that would echo through history. Different empire, different century, different uniforms, same fucking mountains. The First Anglo-Afghan War remains one of history's most powerful reminders that conquering a capital city is often much easier than controlling a country.